You're listening to the Primal Happiness Show, a podcast dedicated to helping you thrive in this crazy modern world. Every Tuesday, we explore the nature of how our minds really work, what exactly the human animal requires to thrive, and how we can live happier and more fulfilling lives. If you're new here and haven't yet taken our free class, then there's no better place to get a jump start on reclaiming your primal happiness. It's where we'll guide you step by step through our antidote to today's modern world. Simply head on over to primalhappiness.co/antidote to get the free class and discover how to thrive without having to move to a planet that's not so crazy as ours. But now, your host, Lian Brook-Tyler.
Hello, my beautiful people. A huge warm welcome back to the show. In today's crazy modern world, men and women are living shallow, disconnected, and unfulfilling lives. So we created the path for those who are ready to reclaim their wildness and actualize their deepest gifts. And the next available way to walk that path is through joining our new crucible, Waking the Wild Heart. This is for you if your heart desires to express its wildest, most vulnerable truth. If your heart aches to be liberated, to be loved and to love at the deepest level. If your heart is calling you to lead your whole life, not from fear, but from love. And if your heart longs for you to become someone of depth, power, and presence. And finally, if you know in your heart that you are ready to create a life overflowing with wild love, pleasure, expression, and purpose. We begin on Thursday, the 3rd of September. There are a few places left. So if you're feeling this is for you, go and claim your place now at primalhappiness.co/WTWH. This week's show is my All the Everything, where I jam on an eclectic mix of topics. This is where you can get up close and personal with me, get inside my head and see what I'm up to and thinking about. It also airs live on Facebook on the first Friday of every month. Usually, this one was a little bit late, but usually it's the first Friday of every month at 2 p.m. UK time. In this episode, I dive deep into how to live a magic-led life. I shared so much about my story for the very first time publicly. I was terrified beforehand. I talked about ladybirds, Shiva, huge phallic things, archetypes, and more. This was the kind of greatest will I be burned at the stake or will I be written off as a lunatic test I've ever had. As I said, I was pretty scared beforehand, but the feedback I've had on the version that went out on Facebook Live has reassured me that I'm not going to be chased out of the village with pitchforks quite yet. So does that sound juicy? Let's jump in. Welcome to August's All the Everything. Hello, here we are. I just realised, and I spoke this out on the Facebook Live version of this, that I'm not this month going to talk about what I've been creating and consuming this month, largely because the topic I'm going to dive deep into is so massive and also holds a lot of fear for me that I just want to kind of focus on that rather than get distracted trying to do a whole load of other things. So we are just in a moment going to go straight into the main topic, which is something along the lines of how to live a magic-led life. And as usually is the case, this was a topic chosen by our lovely Primal Happiness Facebook group members. And I think when I suggested that topic, because normally what I do, for those of you who aren't in our Facebook group, I usually suggest 3 potential topics, although the invitation is there for members to suggest topics too. Typically, the ones I've suggested are the ones that people vote on. And when I came up with this topic name, I honestly don't think I'd actually thought about what I was going to share. It just came to me as a potential topic. And it was only when that became like the clear winner of the topics available I then turned my attention to like, oh, what would I talk about? And I was like, oh my goodness, I can talk about it at this level, which feels quite nice and safe and would still be useful, or I can make this the great unveiling and really talk about it. And so I've been kind of like moving between those two options over the last week. And I think you'll be pleased to know I'm going to go straight into the scary option. This is made even harder by the fact that I've recently committed to have a period of not caveating. I'd had feedback from a few people close to me who know me very well, know where I'm speaking from when I speak on all sorts of things, and had asked, why do I caveat so much? And I'm not going to go into the reasons I caveat so much right now because it would just be another distraction. But if there was ever a time I wanted to caveat, it would be at the beginning of this show. So I've made it even harder for myself because I can't even blooming well caveat before I dive into some stuff I would love to caveat around. All I will say is I am really aware that the things I say on this show are going to be triggering, confusing, off-putting, and lots of other things that I would rather not create in anyone listening to me. And yet I'm doing so in the faith that other things will get created too. We'll see. So where shall I start? I think I'll start, as all good stories do, at the beginning. And actually, before that, I'm going to talk about when I'm talking about what do I mean when I say magic-led life? What do I mean by magic? And I spent a bit of time trying to distill what for me that was. And I came up with this line, and this isn't a perfect line. I didn't spend ages on this, but it's kind of, this is how I'm holding it at the moment. It's the belief in unknown forces, energies, whatever word you want to give to that, at play in creating our experience of life. And that the more that we welcome in these forces, the more magical our life becomes. So this is and so I've probably gone beyond the actual definition of magic. I suppose the magic part is those sort of unknown forces at play. But really, living a magic-led life is about being in conscious relationship, in receptivity to those forces, and then the effect that has on our life. So I will then share now what that's looked like in my life. I absolutely believe this is available to all of us. Okay, so I'm going to start with my story. So I've shared before some parts of my childhood, which wasn't a kind of particularly average childhood, let's say. I lived with my father from the time I was about 6 when my mum and dad split up. And that was a conscious choosing. I wanted to go and live with my father. We were very close. And so that's what happened. And then the first year or so that I was with him, we spent traveling throughout Europe and into Morocco. And it was a very wild life, let's say. We hitchhiked, sometimes public transport, lived most of the time outdoors in some way, like sometimes literally under the stars, sometimes in a tent or some kind of like makeshift. When I say makeshift, I mean really makeshift buildings. One of them, for example, was that I had when we lived in Ibiza, was a kind of bedroom he'd crafted me from oil drums and tarpaulin. So I really mean makeshift. And we very much kind of, I guess, lived like within the abundance of the universe. It's not that he would have languaged it like that, but this sort of this faith that we would be provided to, and provided to in all sorts of ways, which we absolutely were. You know, sometimes that was gifts of food in some way or other. Sometimes that was gifts of shelter. Sometimes that was someone giving us a lift. So at one point we lived in the south of France, and we literally stayed in a room of a family who lived in the south of France. And then for, I don't know, a few months, we lived there whilst my dad helped them to build another house they were building up in the hills. So it really was a case of surrendering to whatever was going to be provided. And so that was a real experience, I guess, of what so many of us now talk about as adults as like this beautiful way of living with trust and surrender and kind of magic and manifestation. And it was just my life. It wasn't even something I knew that we were, I suppose I knew we were choosing it. I knew that it wasn't kind of norm, but I think as children do, we just accept whatever is our life at that moment. So it wasn't like I really saw it as something that was, I don't know, something I could have distinguished and named. Let's say it that way. It's only been something I can distinguish and name in hindsight. And the other thing to say about my father is he was, I guess, quite rare in that he was very strong, both in terms of like left brain and right brain. He had, so he was incredibly intelligent in a kind of like traditional intelligence way. He'd worked as a maths and physics teacher. He had, incredible mind for understanding, science, maths, logic, that kind of thing. But he was also very artistic, very musical, and very kind of open, I guess, to spirituality and magic. Something I shared recently is I learned my left and right from the tarot card, like floor to ceiling tarot cards he painted on our sitting room wall of the magician on the right and the high priestess on the left. And so that gives you a fairly good indication of the man he was. So he kind of went for a phase where he was really deep into tarot. And that obviously that kind of way of seeing the world, which I've actually realized more recently as I've become interested in tarot, there is, I guess, one way of seeing it, which is this, I guess, sort of stereotypical fortune telling, kind of end of the pier style tarot reading. And then there is this way of being in the tarot, which is a portal into archetypes and magic and mystery. And that's very much what I can see where he was entering into that from. So I don't make this at all about tarot particularly, but I just want to use that as an indication of what I grew up with as normal. And there was just also just a lot of, I guess, sort of fantasy, but not fantasy being sort of separate and being called fantasy, if that makes any sense, as in the books that he read and then I would read were often very much about kind of myth and magic. So obvious ones like Lord of the Rings. But he would then explore them into other formats like writing songs, which would then sing together. So there was a lot of that, again, like embedded in my life in a way where I didn't have this distinction of, oh, this is real life and then this is kind of make-believe fairy tale stuff. It all felt quite blended in. And it's hard ever to know what your life would have been like if it had taken a different turn. But I share all that really to say that I think that kind of childhood is obviously not the norm in our culture. There's elements of it that are probably much closer to how Indigenous cultures raise their children or even lived in that kind of deep connection with the universe, with nature, with our subconscious. But who knows, maybe my rest of my story would be exactly the same if I hadn't had that childhood. But I share that because I do feel there's probably some relevance there. And then I don't know at what point exactly I started to realize like my mind didn't behave in ways that were normal. Because again, I think I had this quite like shaky grasp on what was normal anyway. But I think the first couple of things I noticed was I would, from quite a young age, have what you could call kind of disassociated episodes where I would be in a kind of everyday situation and then would feel I wasn't really there and I was in a kind of different realm and would somehow have to act as if I was in this realm. And the first couple of times that happened, it really scared me because it was so, it was like I couldn't ignore it. It was a real conscious effort to try and behave as normal when it didn't feel like I was there at all. And then what was probably the next thing that happened? I think the next thing that happened was, and this is when I was, I think, early teens. I had my first nighttime hallucination, which are sometimes called, there's two types that are called hypnagognic hallucination and hypnopompic hallucinations. One is one that you have on falling asleep, and the other one is on waking up. One's rarer than the other, and typically I think people have one or the other. I have both. But the very first one I had was absolutely terrifying. Partly because it was the first, so I had no basis for it, but partly because of the nature of it. So I'd gone to sleep. My dad had been out. He came into the front door and I guess must have disturbed my sleep in coming in. I woke up and looked at my bedroom wall and the posters, those in the kind of days we'd have posters, my posters were kind of shifting, like completely moving all around my bedroom wall. So as you can probably imagine, I screamed the house down because that's not okay, is it? Like, who wants their posters moving around their wall? So he walked, bless my poor dad, he walked up the stairs to hear me screaming the house down, came running into my room thinking, what's happened to her? Like she'd been attacked or something. I was pointing to the wall saying like whatever I was saying, but probably a lot of screaming, but saying something about the posters, which of course weren't really moving. He couldn't see them. I was sitting bolt upright in bed looking at them like, what the hell is going on? Am I losing my mind? And then I've no idea how that kind of like how I realized, but I have then since had hundreds of hallucinations of that kind, not that particular scenario, but of varying types. So at some point in the hallucination, either the hallucination stops or I recognize, oh, it's a hallucination, even though it looks completely real. Anyway, so I'm guessing one of those two things happened, and that was the first of many. And I'm going to talk a bit more about those because that ended up being quite integral to the next stage of my story, but I'm just going to dip into a couple of other things first. Another thing that I then developed a little bit later was what some people call an oral migraine. Apparently, the correct name for the particular thing I have is something like scintillating scotoma or something like that, scintillating scotoma. And it's where you see a kind of like zigzag rainbow across your vision. They don't really know what causes it. Like there is no kind of like understanding of what it is. To be honest, the same is actually true for migraines in general. There's a real lack of understanding. The thing I get isn't a migraine. Like you don't get a headache or anything with it. You just lose your normal vision and see this kind of like rainbow zigzag going across your vision for 20, 30 minutes, something like that. So it was like I was getting this collection of weird things, which added up. And I suppose there's also this, it's hard to even put this into words. There was a kind of real underlying fear of something else that I didn't know what it was, which sounds a really stupid thing to say. I've always been terrified of the dark, and terrified really of what could happen. And when I say what could happen, I couldn't even really distill that, but I just had some awareness. There was something kind of in my mind or in my being to be scared of that I kind of didn't want to let in, or I didn't want to let out. I don't know. And then these kind of like these weird things that I'd have happen, like the hallucinations and all the rest of it, just really kind of fueled that fear. Like there's something that's not quite right with me, because most people don't have this collection of weird things. I need to kind of keep my guard up, which I think is probably not just a cultural kind of, there's a real cultural bias for us to become very like logical and linear and masculine. So I'm sure that played a part, but I think there's also this underlying fear, there's something wrong with me and I can't kind of let it take over me, that made me even more like that. So I went from this amazing kind of wild, magical upbringing into becoming someone that just had no room for anything that couldn't be logically explained. Like to a ridiculous extent, like ridiculous. It was just, okay, whatever it is that someone's talking about, where's the evidence? Where's the scientific proof? Well, if there isn't any, I'm just not interested. Like it was quite ridiculous and very limiting. And yet it was what made sense to me and how life felt safe to me, I guess. So that, I wonder if I would have carried on like that forever had my dad not died, and then everything that came about as a result of him dying. Honestly, I've only really just realized that. I think that was the real turning point for me. Otherwise, I think I just would have carried on like that, with a real kind of like shutdown of anything that couldn't be logically explained. So he then died suddenly in 2012. And I'm not going to spend too long in that part of my story, because I've spoken about this part quite a lot before. But in essence, as I said before, we were very, very close. I was brought up by him. Really, I think there was a real dread of the idea of him ever dying, because I was just like, how the hell would I cope? And it turned out to be an incredible rupture for me in a way that was I just unforeseeable in terms of the gifts that it brought, as well as, of course, the loss that it also brought. And that was the start, really, of me waking up to magic again. And it happened really fast, like within, I think even the same day as he died, something changed in me. And that increased. And I don't want to, again, spend too long on this section of the story, but in real short way of sort of summarizing this up, I think firstly, I had a real growing sense of there being something beyond the known, beyond this realm, beyond the earth, beyond the like material plane, as it were. And I also had a really strong sense of a very tangible connection to his spirit, I suppose you could say. And those two things were so clear to me. There wasn't even a place for me to like reckon with it. There wasn't a way that I could say, well, where's the logic for this? It was just undeniable. It was just so in my experience, I couldn't really deny it, because it was just there in front of me. That said, aside from those two things, everything else was still coming through this lens of, can it be logically explained? So it was like, in some ways, like the biggest stuff of all was okay now. Like, okay, there is something beyond this kind of earth, the material plane. There is something which is kind of the biggest, hardest thing to provide evidence for of all. That could be okay without evidence, but nothing else could. It was still kind of all kept over here, nice and neat. But then over the years, and then a year, almost the day after he died, I'd had this kind of ongoing like awakening to, I guess, the universe, spirituality, however you want to name it. And then a year, almost the day after he died, I came across the three principles and read a line that someone had just posted in a blog post. It said something like, thought creates reality. And it was a kind of like another like real sort of dropping into this sense of, wow, nothing is quite as it appeared. Me being me, because again, my life had been so viewed through this lens of what can be explained and understood very logically, maybe it couldn't have happened another way other than by this lens of the three principles, which in themselves are quite, principles, even the word principles is something that's nice and logical and neat. And so possibly if it had come in any other form, I'd have been a no to it. But as it happened, it came in that form. So I could digest it and understand it very like intellectually, but also from this understanding of this, whatever word again you want to call it, oneness, divine love that I'd experienced in the year before. So all of that was kind of fairly consumable for me without having to disrupt this way of being in life that everything had to be logically explained. Let me just take a breather. I feel like I've rattled on and I'm just want to make sure I kind of slow down at points where it needs it. Give me a moment. So much still of this story to share. I might have to start to decide which bits to skip over. Okay. Then I think the next real shift, I guess, in my story was probably interviewing, I think, first of all, reading Pam Grout's books and then interviewing her. So Pam Grout's the author of E Squared and E Cubed. Other books, I think, too, but they were the two ones that had a big impact on me. And it was, I guess, an invitation into understanding things that already I'd kind of accepted as like, yep, that's okay. There is this kind of thing that's the spirit world and it obeys these laws. And she was inviting that kind of more into how we can be in relationship to this on this kind of earthly plane. So much more kind of magical way of actually being in the world and experiencing the world. And the two bits that really stood out for me that kind of were like, oh gosh, how am I going to how do I accept this if I can't logically explain it, but yes, it's happened, was when I read her first book, there's an exercise in it where you kind of like ask the universe or ask the spirit world or whatever for a sign. And when I did that exercise, it was kind of the middle of the winter, I think, at the time. And I asked my dad to give me a sign that somehow his kind of consciousness was still around. Like, again, I really felt that it was, but it was like, okay, I'd like some evidence now, please. And again, it was in the middle of the winter, but for whatever reason, I decided the sign I wanted to see was a ladybird. And then very shortly after, I was in the bath and saw one kind of circling around the hot tap. And then later the same day, I saw, and I don't know, it may have been the same one, walking around my bedside lampshade. So I was like, okay, could still be written off as coincidence, kind of cool. Didn't think too much of it. A year later, I was reading her follow-up book, E Cubed. And when I read that, it reminded me of the experiment I'd done the year before. She calls them experiments with the ladybirds. So I then decided, I was laying in bed upstairs, my children were downstairs playing, and I decided to ask for another sign. And I obviously didn't say out loud, but in my mind, I said, can one of the children bring me something in bed? And this is where this gets really freaky. 10 minutes later, my daughter Aurelia, who I guess must have been about maybe 5. Yeah, maybe 5, I think, at the time, came upstairs, appeared next to me in bed and said, I brought this for you, Mummy, and opened her hands, and it was a glass ladybird from my studio here downstairs. And so I was just kind of like, that's weird. And then she said, hang on a sec, ran off into her bedroom, came back from her bedroom. This is giving me goosebumps telling the story again. And had brought me a ladybird, like a rock that had been painted as a ladybird. And then gave me that as well. So I'm sitting there with two kind of like ladybirds and said, keep that, mummy. And she said it on top of it, on the ladybird she'd handed me, the second one, it said, I love you. And she said, yes, it's saying, I love mummy and I love Aurelia, and then gave them both to me. So that was one of those moments you're like, this is really hard to explain as a coincidence. And I definitely still had, oh, sorry, the dogs have decided it's time to go out. I definitely still had some real skepticism. I definitely wasn't kind of sold on that as being like, this is definite proof of magic. But I was getting to the point where I'm thinking, that one's pretty hard to explain away. And so it was very much a kind of invitation into like, well, maybe I'm willing to believe there is a possibility of there being magic in the world. It was kind of more like that, like a kind of skeptical openness, let's say. One final bit more to this Pam Grout story that I'm going to share with you, because it definitely was this kind of like increasing openness to the idea of magic, came very much from her role, I guess, in my life, was maybe a year later than that. I don't know. I can't quite remember. May have been quite soon after that, because I can't remember if I was reading the second book because I was about to interview her. I can't remember. But anyway, I was interviewing her for the podcast. And because she was back in my mind again, I decided to ask the universe for a gift that particular day. And the backdrop to this is I had been losing my hearing in both ears for the previous 10 years or so. I have a condition called otosclerosis, which often does worsen in pregnancy. And it's a condition that affects the bones in the inner ear, basically. So I was gradually losing my hearing to the point where I was probably more than half deaf in both ears. So really struggled to hear. I had to wear a hearing aid. And so this particular day, and you can imagine, I had like endless tests and checkups and all the things, and had just been, again, given one terrible hearing aid after another. And it was kind of like, yep, it's likely to get worse and worse and worse for the rest of your life. There's nothing you can do with it. Anyway, so this particular day, I asked the universe for a gift. And I happened to have a regular hearing check, or might have been actually a hearing aid service or something. I can't remember. It was very like just standard thing with an audio technician. It wasn't even with a consultant. And so I went along, and he was going through this, like, they sort of, it's quite techie these days. They kind of like literally plug your hearing aid in like a phone to the computer. And as he was doing this, he was sort of chatting away saying, do you know what caused your hearing loss? And at that point, I didn't know. So I was like, no, I don't know. They say it's probably, potentially hereditary. Nothing can be done. And he's like, it's just interesting. He said, looking at what I can see here, it looks like it could be a condition called otosclerosis. It's like, oh, well, yeah. But clearly one of the many consultants I've seen over the years would have said that if it was that. He's like, yeah, maybe worth just getting that checked out. I was like, okay. He said, the thing is, if it is that, there is actually an operation which you might be kind of suitable for, which could bring your hearing back. And I'm feeling actually quite emotional remembering back to that, actually. I think, like, hearing him say that, there was part of me who just thought, I can't get my hopes up. Like, after all these years, some random audio technician saying there is a chance of me getting my hearing back was just like, I can't even kind of give credence to that. And then there was another part of me like, well, I asked for a gift today. Maybe this is the gift. Turned out it was the gift. And I had that looked into. It turned out he was totally right. It was that condition. I then had a scan to assess whether it was possible for me to have the operation. Turned out I could. I had the operation and it returned my hearing almost entirely. I've only had one ear done because I can actually get by perfectly well with that. So I'm still deaf in the other ear, but I can hear perfectly well with my operated on ear. So, hey, that was the gift that I asked for and received. So all of that sounds wonderful. the downside of this was, as I guess, opened up to this idea of magic and the unknown and things not making logical sense, is my nighttime hallucinations had got worse and worse and worse, to the point where some weeks I'd be woken up several times in a week. And if you can imagine, even though it might sound, when you're hearing this in the daytime, knowing the hallucinations, you're like, well, was that a big deal? If you can imagine, you're fast asleep, wake up, there is a massive spider, like this size spider, dangling from the ceiling above you. And even if you're not scared of spiders, which I'm not, that's fairly terrifying. Excuse my language. I think I managed to just swallow the swear word there. And when you don't know it's hallucination, because I never know it's hallucination in the moment, there is a massive spider hanging above me in bed. So on a regular basis, if it was a hallucination of that kind in particular, I'd scream, wake up my husband, ask him to help me search the bed, like get out of bed, like just freak out, as you can probably imagine. And so it was pretty disruptive and it's scary, you know, like when I'd go to bed, I wouldn't know if I was going to have one. I wouldn't know what it was going to be like. And they started getting, I mean, I'd had some really odd ones over the years, but the nature of them was getting like weirder and weirder, where it felt like almost, how could I say this? There felt like more intention behind them, I suppose, like more meaning, more intention, more presence even. And I remember one in particular that I absolutely hated, which might sound odd, like why would you hate that? But it just felt really eerie, was a red rose just kind of like hanging in midair next to my bedroom door. And that one really freaked me out. So anyway, these hallucinations just got worse and worse to that point where I was like, I just can't go on like this. There has to be some, you know, something I can do. And around this time, thankfully, because of the work I do, I was getting to speak to people who I guess had a much healthier relationship to this side of life than I did, including shamans. And so I was interviewing on the podcast and kept noticing like real similarities between their stories, like they're people who had been kind of like given a normal Western upbringing and then had kind of ended up on the path of shamanism. There was often real similarities between their early childhood or experiences of kind of things that were unexplainable and mine. And so this kind of what you typically see with people who, I mean, don't have to call themselves shamans, but people in like who have chosen into that path and embraced it, typically will have exhibited what you could say, I suppose, is like increased sensitivity, or sort of strange hallucinations, or, you know, all sorts of things that made sense when they were saying, I'd be thinking, oh yeah, I have my own version of that and I have my own version of that. Still, it wasn't like I was kind of like a hell yes and embracing it, but it certainly was enough for me to think it might be worth me speaking to a shaman about what's happening for me. And what order do I say this, actually? I think, actually, I'll tell you one, I think the final hallucination, which kind of tipped me over the edge, actually, I think I probably told this story slightly out of order, was my hallucinations up until that point had always been fairly like small in physical size, if that makes sense, like a spider size, a rose size, that kind of thing. And then this particular night, I woke up and realized some huge black shadow was coming across the ceiling. And I sat there thinking, what the hell is happening? What is that? And it carried on moving across the ceiling until it took up the entire room. And any of you that's read the description of this show will see me say something like huge phallic shaped things. That was a very phallic shaped thing, let's just say that. And so, yes, I woke up to I'm just going to shut my door before I say this part because I've got small children in the house. I'm hoping my dress didn't just raise up and show my knickers. Apologies if you were watching on the live and it did. Anyway, so in short, basically, my whole bedroom ceiling was filled with a big cock. I don't think I actually consciously thought that at the time, but I could recognize it was that kind of phallic shape. And just thought, when I finally, obviously at the time, I was just terrified and just thought, my whole world's about to end. Then obviously realized the hallucination and then thought, I am not down with this anymore. I cannot live like this. That is absolutely ridiculous to be woken up with my ceiling being taken up with that. So that's when I decided to have the conversation with the shaman. And when I had that conversation with the shaman, she invited me really into allowing some space for that in my life. So it didn't have to the way I guess she languaged it, she didn't use these words, was this is clearly something that wants itself, not itself as in it's a thing, but like a way of being or part of you wants some space in your life and it's trying to force its way in because you're not open to it. Perhaps if you open to it, it's not going to manifest in these unwanted ways it currently is. And I had this really clear sense when I was talking to her, like that sounds fairly sensible and definitely something worth trying. But when I spoke to her, I realized I just had such a fear of doing that. I remember saying to her, she said, how does that sound? And I said, terrifying. And she said, what's behind that fear? And I said, mostly that I'm just going to lose my mind. Like there is a real fear here that I'm going to get lost in this madness, this unknown, this fear that I've always had that I can't language. I'm going to get lost in that. I'm going to lose my mind and stroke or probably both. I'm going to get metaphorically chased out the village with pitchforks. I mean, I actually had a real visceral, who knows, it may be from a past life, I don't know, but I had a real visceral memory of that happening. And so it didn't feel like this ridiculous fear. It was just like, no, that is a real concern. It's the other dog now. I'm going to let him in. I'm going to make sure I pull my dress down first. Give me a sec. Right, in your bed. So, where was I? Oh yes, Pitchforks Village. So yeah, this wasn't a lightweight low level fear. This was absolutely terrifying. This was, maybe I'll just keep with the nighttime visions. Thanks. That's okay. I'll find a way to be cool about that. That really was one of the very valid options I was thinking about at the time, because the alternative was still so scary to me. And then ultimately, I guess I just thought, well, I'm going to trust that I'm not going to just lose my mind and it's going to work out, even though it still is really scary. I'm just going to check this is all still working. Yes, it looks like it's still live, I think. Okay, right, let me just gather my thoughts. This has been a very long story and I think I'm through the worst of it. Let me just have a look. Okay, so the first thing I did was allow some conscious daytime space for this unknown, let's call it, to make itself known, to come into consciousness. And so the very first time I sat down and meditated, but it wasn't with the idea of clearing my mind. It was actually with the idea of opening my mind to allow whatever wanted to come through. I'm really noticing like how edgy it is for me to talk like this, and worrying that you are really judging me for being woo and illogical, but I am going to plow onwards. So the very first time I sat and did that, I had an incredible, very lucid, almost embodied experience of, I didn't realize it was Shiva at the time, but this huge, huge figure, godlike figure, coming towards me, touched me on the forehead. And it's hard to even do, it was very much a kind of like, it's hard to really describe it because it was an experience as opposed to a message or anything I can really articulate, but it was profound. And it I guess, gave me that sense of there is something here, even if I still can't explain it. What if I just keep listening? And through that time, and it's hard to even, this is the bit where I wish I could give a bit of a clearer sort of sense of how this came about. But during this time, there was this sense of I'm being asked to be in service of the feminine. And this was really early on, actually, in my journey of even understanding there was something called the archetypal feminine, divine feminine, anything like that. There was not really, at that point, I didn't have this kind of like body of understanding or knowledge or reading about it. It was much more a kind of very early sense of it, and yet a very clear sense of this is what I'm in service to. And a kind of growing sense of being called to become an embodiment of the divine feminine, which I was kind of okay with. It was very counter to anything I'd known. Had a very, I guess, feminist upbringing, very much identified as a feminist. And so even this idea of like the feminine felt quite out there and quite edgy, and yet there was something deeper that made sense. So I followed that. The part that I wasn't cool with, and then if you think back to both the appearance of Shiva and the phallic object does make sense. The bit that I really struggled with was this idea of, in order to become an embodiment of the divine feminine, I also then need to be in devotion to the divine masculine. That was triggering. That was something that took me a lot longer to come to terms with, to, I guess, agree to, and to ultimately, I guess, give myself over to. So that took much, much longer. And it was really, I think I finally made that decision or agreement once it became clear there is only so far in this calling I have to be in service of the feminine. There's only so far I can go there until I'm also willing to be in devotion to the divine masculine. Like, it stops here until I'm willing to do this. So that, I've often been asked how I ended up doing this work of the feminine. That's the clearest answer I can give. I mean, it has no kind of thing that makes sense. It was just what was provided to me, and I decided to trust. An interesting part of this, which was still when I was definitely didn't have it clearly distilled, that there was kind of both were needed, both the masculine and feminine were needed, that as part of this descent into the feminine, opening my mind to magic, kind of arose this archetype of the Wild Priestess. And so that became almost like the channel through which I was going to pour both of these intentions, the intention for the feminine, the intention for magic, which you could say are actually the same thing. I decided to kind of channel them into embodying and expressing this archetype that I was calling, or had been kind of provided to me, of the Wild Priestess. The kind of funny part of this is the coach I chose to work with on this is known for her work around feminine submission to the masculine. I I'm happy to name her, actually. Her work is absolutely amazing. So if you're feeling called to anything around feminine submission, I would absolutely go check her out. She's called Gillian Pothier. So yeah, the irony is, even though that wasn't what I chose her for, it wasn't kind of like a conscious part of our work. Because of that, that has become increasingly what her work is solely about. I think solely, it may not be solely, but it's mainly about that. That wasn't why I chose to work with her. But of course, that was like baked in. And I can now see in hindsight, oh, of course, like that makes so much sense that was necessary in order for me to do the work that I came here to do. Okay, let me take a breather. Okay, so, just as an aside, during this period, which that everything I've just said, from the point where I had that original conversation with the shaman to then choosing to work with this coach and embodying this wild priestess archetype, this happened within a space of a month or two. It's very short. And within that time, and I think almost like immediately, from probably around the time I had that first vision of Shiva, the nighttime hallucinations completely stopped. They've gone from being sometimes like a few times a week to completely gone. So turned out the shaman was right. Anyway, and so now have I had any nighttime hallucination? Maybe one or two. Maybe I've had one or two since then. Possibly none. I'm struggling to like be absolutely certain whether, and maybe I've had a couple, but I don't actually know if I have even had a couple. So the only time I now do have visions is when I'm consciously choosing to open to them, like if I'm in a coaching session, or I'm kind of opening the space like in daytime meditation for that. The rest of the time, there is no this kind of forcing their way in the way that it was. Okay, so I think we're nearly at the end of the story. What else is going to be helpful? Linking this to magic. And so I'm going to say this part in a way that ties into my particular story. But I do absolutely believe this way of living, living as magic, is true for all of us. It's just going to take on a different flavor. So me personally, the more I am following that path of being in service to the feminine, to make contact with my soul, with my kind of feminine heart's desire, the more the divine masculine provides to me. And that's again why it's so important to have that devotion, because both are needed. And so I am provided to in amazing, magical, sometimes instant ways. And so that when I talk about a magic-led life, that's what I mean. And it requires both parts. It requires me to be in deep listening, surrender, relationship to my heart's desire. And it requires that devotion, submission, receptivity to being provided to by what I'm calling the divine masculine. You might want to call it God, the universe, or anything else. And what I see is true for all of us is that we are going to have our own version of that. I believe those two archetypal energies, flipping dogs, I believe those two archetypal energies, the masculine and feminine, are absolutely available to all of us. I don't believe that all of us have to follow the path that I have. I believe everyone's going to have their own version of a path to magic that may look nothing like mine, may not involve being in service to the divine feminine, for example. Just happened that was mine, and following that kind of soul desire took me that way. That created my way of living as magic. What I would say is true is, and this actually I've spoken about a lot, I sometimes call, and I think these are slightly interchangeable, but there's differences. I often talk about living a soul-led life, which I also do say is true for me. There was a point a year or two ago where I made a very conscious decision to say, I am now done with living through this lens of what can be logically explained. It's not that I'm throwing that out entirely. I'm still interested in that, but ultimately I'm living from soul. That comes first. And whatever my soul's calling me to, that gets my attention. And I think a version of that needs to happen for anyone that wants to step onto that path of a magic-led life. And for me, in terms of like, how does that show up in like the daily ways I live? It goes back to that sense of what am I in service to? What am I in devotion to? And then what makes sense to me from there. So I've shared on this show loads of times things like the relationship I have with my special tree, which for me is I often see actually as a kind of representation of the divine masculine, like the kind of pilgrimage I take there, the conversations I have, the way I pray there is very much providing that to me. The rituals I do that I call Rose, I talked about it on the webinar yesterday. Was it yesterday? Can't remember. Might have been the day before. And so Rose for me is relax, open, soften, and energize. Energize meaning allow the energy of love to come through you. And so I have various rituals of devotion that involve that rose embodiment, and actually often actually involve using oils, and particularly the oil of rose. So I have those ways of living that, like that for me is part of living a magic-led life. That's like me doing my bit. So I'm then available to receive the magic. You again will have your own. I'm just going to quickly nip to a question I was asked by one of our group members, because I think this will give a kind of, hopefully, a bit more tangible example. And then I think we're nearly closing. I think I'm nearly at a point where I can kind of like, okay, I think my story for now is done. So the sort of main part of the question was something really interesting regarding this journey is how you've established a village within this realm, including what you experienced. I've started to realize and notice some imbalances in some friendships, which I felt were not a huge part of, were a huge part of my life. I've also been feeling quite lonely during this time in my life due to not having found that village. I sense that many women do not want to connect with me, even though this can be very superficial. So do not want to connect with me, even though this can be very superficial at times. But still, I've always felt through many stages of my life on the outer. This is something I really struggle with. And firstly, I really hear that, that's again, so much part of the work that Jonathan and I are doing. Talking about Jonathan, actually, I really want to make sure I say something about him before I close this. That's a lot of our work is to return people to that sort of those deep bonds, that deep belonging that are absolutely essential, actually, to our species. And then specifically, when it comes to those of us who have made that choice to live from soul, live a magic-led life, that can be even more challenging. It's challenging enough to find people to kind of form that metaphorical village with, let alone when you're kind of stepping outside what is like the norm, what is acceptable. And what I would say, and this might sound like a bit of a, simple answer, but I really do believe that once we start to set foot on that path of returning to soul, living with an open heart, anything we want can be made manifest. If we are allowing what's in alignment for us, those soul-led desires to come through our heart into the world, that will manifest in all the ways that we most desire. So I realize more and more that I don't need to be in charge of kind of controlling outcomes, like, oh, I want this to happen and it needs to happen this way and it needs to happen this time scale. More and more I'm recognizing like the more I live from here, that stuff just gets brought to me. So again, apologies if that sounds like very simple, but I honestly think this is as like deep as it gets, really. It's just like how we live creates everything around us. Okay, so in closing, I guess coming back to you listening, you're going to have your own version of this. I do really believe like this is a life that's available to all of us. And I think first and foremost, it's just to heed that invitation. if you're listening to this, I'm guessing this must feel like it's for you on some level. And so how are those sparkles of magic showing up for you? It might be that you don't have, a version of what I shared, like the way that I was kind of thrust into magic, almost kicking and screaming. I don't think that everyone does have that clearly, but you'll have your own way that magic's kind of showing up, little sparkles here and there for you. And then where is it calling you next? I often say life is always about just following that next breadcrumb. Like, what is that next breadcrumb of magic for you? Okay, I think that's all I can share at the moment. Yeah, I feel there's obviously so much more I could share in terms of like how that shows up for me in my life. There's lots of other stories I could give you, but that feels like the kind of main structure that I really felt I wanted to give. And then if there's questions that you have off the back of this, let me know. I'm really happy to talk more about this. I feel like now I've done this, it's like, okay, the floodgates are open, the worst of it's out. There's not really much else I can hide. So yeah, please do ask away. I guess the good news is, so far, I don't believe I've completely lost my mind and I haven't been forced out of the village at the end of a pitchfork. So that's the good news. So if you're feeling this call, I believe we are now safe. I believe the time is right for those of us feeling the call to magic to do so, and we will be okay. That's what I really feel is so true now. So, if you, so if you're not already a member of our group, go join us, because everything I've been speaking about here, we talk about in the group. You'll also be kind of up to date with anything that's happening, taking place, that we're offering. For example, the webinar that I just briefly mentioned, that happened again, I think Wednesday. I've lost track of days this week, and the replay is actually available in there as well. And that's at facebook.com/groups/primal happiness. And then you'll also get to vote on whatever I'm going to talk about next month. But I would really recommend going to check out the replay of the webinar we did, which was on the topic of something like unleashing the power of your wild heart. And this was a kind of, I guess, first steps along the journey of waking the wild heart, which is a crucible that Jonathan and I are creating in September, which is going to be amazing. So you can go and find out more about Waking the Wild Heart at primalhappiness.co/WTWH. We'll be talking about, I may not be using exactly these words that we're talking about here, magic, but ultimately like living from an open heart, living from soul, living as love. So if that feels like it could be for you, go check that out. Finally, I said I was going to mention Jonathan. The thing I would say is I actually don't know if any of what I've just described would have happened if I hadn't been in partnership with Jonathan. One of his absolute gifts is his ability to see what's possible for others, see their gifts. And so way before I was even close to being able to acknowledge that this was kind of for me, he knew, he told me on a regular basis, he encouraged me every step of the way. And yeah, so if you listen to this, Jonathan, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I really wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you doing what I do, being who I am. And I'd also say that we probably all need someone like that, whether that is a business partner, whether that is a friend, whether that is a coach, whether that is that metaphorical village. I think we all do need others who are attuned, conscious to a different way of living. So really encourage you to, again, tap into like living from that space. What's that going to show up for you? What's your desire in that way? So I think I'm done. If there's anything you want to ask, again, please do let me know. This is a topic that it looks like I'm now talking about. So I'm prepared to say more if you're interested in more. Thank you so much if you're joining me live, if you're watching the replay live, or you're listening now to the audio on the podcast. I really appreciate it and you. Have a wonderful weekend. Lots of love. Bye-bye. Mwah, mwah, mwah. So that's all for this month. I'd love to know what you took from this show. What are you seeing is your path to magic? How's magic showing up in little sparkles in your life? If you'd like to share what came up for you, the Primal Happiness Facebook group is a wonderful place to do just that. The link for that is facebook.com/group/primal happiness. And I'd also love to have your feedback, questions, and topic suggestions. And you can take part in the monthly poll that decides whatever topic I'll talk about on the next All the Everything. And the group is the best place for all of those too. If you would like to join me live for the next making of All the Everything that happens on Facebook Live, you'll be very welcome. If you like our Facebook page, facebook.com/primal happiness, you can watch out for the show airing live on the first Friday of every month at 2 p.m. BST or GMT, depending on the time of the year. If you'd like to get the notes and links for everything we spoke about this week, hop on over to the show notes, and they're at primalhappiness.co/episode 293. And if you know in your heart that you're ready to create a life overflowing with wild love, pleasure, expression, and purpose, come and join us for Waking the Wild Heart. We begin on Thursday, the 3rd of September. So only a couple of weeks left, and there are only a few places left. So if you're feeling this is for you, go and claim your place now at primalhappiness.co/WTWH. If you don't want to miss out on next week's episode, and it is an incredible one, absolutely incredible, head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, or your Android or iOS app of choice. Hit subscribe, and as if by magic, you're going to get each episode straight to your device as soon as it comes out. Thank you so much for listening. You've been wonderful. Catch you again next Tuesday.